A Lantern, Chapter 2. The sun shining through the propped-up canvas of the wagon wakened Abby. Wide-eyed she looked out through the aperture upon the same setting of the night before, but now it was changed. The child lived a life in each of the two distinct worlds, and it is not possible to say which one she most enjoyed. One of them was made of moonbeams and stardust, of night winds and cloud fancies, of aristocratic gentlemen and lovely ladies. The other was the equally pleasant one of boiled potatoes and salt pork, of games with Basil and Mary, of riding atop old buck or picking wildflowers at the edge of the timber. Just now the prosaic world of every day seemed the more attractive of the two. James had replenished the night fire and Mother was cooking breakfast. With the odor of frying pork and corn cakes strong on the air, the team of horses and the oxen were eating close by, the horses guzzling their grain noisily, the oxen chewing slowly and stolidly. Maggie O'Connor Mackenzie was a heavy, dumpy woman, her body the shape of a pudding bag tied in the middle. One shawl was wrapped around the shapeless figure, and a smaller one over her head was knotted under her fat chin. Strands of heavy black hair showed around the edges of the head shawl, and the face enclosed in its folds was round and smooth, fat and placid. Only her dark Irish eyes, the color of the blue-black waters at Kilkee, and a dimple in the middle of her rolling chin gave a touch of reality to the old romance of the peasant girl. This was the last day of the journey, which had been of 3 weeks' duration. 6 decades later, James Mackenzie was to make the journey back with a grandson in one day. Breakfast over, the little cavalcade set out with much noisy chatter, reminders of not to forget this and that. Did you put out the last of the fire, Denny? Fasten that buckle on Whitey's bridle bell. The mother drove the horse team, James the oxen. Walking alongside the latter, James' boyish gee or ha or whoa how rang out with the valiant attempts to make the note stentorian. Buck was a red and white animal, boy a brindle, and as they walked they swung their huge heads rhythmically from side to side, the brass buttons atop their horns shining in the morning sun. Almost at the first rod's length of the journey, little Basil had to stop the procession to change from one wagon to the other. Belle rode on the seat with her mother, but because it was early and cool, Abby, Mary, and Denny walked behind, darting off the trail to gather mayflowers or wild bouncing bets. Sometimes they jumped over the young rosenweeds and wild blue phlox, and occasionally they caught on the back of the wagon, clutching onto the household goods and swinging their feet off the ground for a few moments. About 9, they forded a stream. The oxen ahead crossed slowly, lumberingly, with many stops in that foolish, stolid way they had. When they were across, Mother Mackenzie drove her team into the creek bed. As the horses were going up the bank, one of them stumbled, crowding against its mate. There was a creaking and a backing and a shouting and a tipping. One sack of flour began falling slowly, and then another and another. 8 sacks of flour, pushing against each other, slipped slowly into the water like fat, clumsy old men reluctant to wet their feet. Maggie Mackenzie was out and managing her horses by way of their bridles, while James, running back from his own wagon, assisted in bringing order out of the catastrophe. Then someone called excitedly, "Look out for the bedding!" and 2 great pillows started floating downstream with majestic motion, as though the geese from which their contents had been plucked were suddenly coming to life. "Och and och!" The mother wrung her hands in distress. 8 sacks of flour and 2 pillows were a fortune. Abby and Denny and little Basil, their laughter high with excitement, all ran alongside of the creek bed after the pillows. In the meantime, James and Belle were wading into the stream and pulling out the sacks. To the mother, the disaster seemed more than she could bear. "Och, if I ever get there," said Maggie O'Connor Mackenzie. "Sure, and I'll never lave the spot." Sure, and she never did. Many years later, she died a 1/4 mile from the place where she first stepped out of the wagon. When the last sack was retrieved, the entire family, with much dire foreboding, crowded around James, who was opening a sack to see how the contents fared. It was as though the whole of life's future hung on the outcome. To their extreme relief, the wet flour had formed but a thin paste, which, with a few moments drying in the sun, now high and hot, would form a crust and keep the precious contents unharmed. In spite of the delay, the family reached the settlement on the Cedar River by the middle of the afternoon and stopped near the log cabin of Tom Graves, the man whom the older sister Janet had come out to marry. Janet herself, hearing the creaking of the wagons, came hurrying down the grassy trail to meet them, a 3-week-old baby in her arms. The baby was something by way of a surprise to the entire group of relatives, his arrival having taken place after the family had started westward. Maggie O'Connor Mackenzie, with much clucking and chirping and adjustment of clothing, welcomed her first grandchild. "Sure, and he's the big one. How did you get along? Is he good? Did you have a doctor or a neighbor woman?" Janet answered them all while her mother was still talking. "Oh yes, there was a doctor, Doc Matthews, over at town. Cedar Falls was quite a place. It had a sawmill and a hotel and a store, a dozen log cabins, and a few frame ones. The schoolhouse had the only tower bell in the state. For pay, Tom was to haul in a load of firewood for the doctor's office stove. He had a 2-roomed house, part log and part frame. The oxen behind them slathered and snorted. There was a smell in the air of newly cut chips. The woods back of the cabin looked thick and impenetrable beyond the short arrows of the sun. And when Tom Graves himself came out of the timber, his axe, the insignia of the fight, on his shoulder. "Here's my mother, Tom, and this is Belle, and that one is Mary, and that boy is James, and this one Denny, and here's little Basil. And over there with the reddish-brown hair is Abby. We almost forgot her." So much was to be said, and all at once. "We've got a house all ready for you, Mother. It's Grandpa Deal's sheep shed. The Deals have been here for 3 years, but they moved down farther on the prairie, now in a fine big log house. You can have this until you get your own cabin done. We've cleaned it all out for you and hung a thick quilt over the opening, and if it storms, you can come in with us." And so Maggie O'Connor Mackenzie, who had lived in the great Aberdeen townhouse and on 2 Scotch country estates, was to make her bed now in a sheep shed. Everyone turned in to help with the settling. From the wagons they took out the walnut bedsteads and the bedding and the highboy. They brought in the heavy cumbersome guns and the powder horn and splint-bottom chairs. Maggie Mackenzie brought in her flat iron, into which one put glowing hickory embers through an iron door, and she hung up the iron tallow lamp, with a homespun wick hanging over the side like a tongue hanging grotesquely from the side of a mouth. If she could have foreseen that 2 granddaughters, Mrs. Harrison Scannell Rhodes and Mrs. Frederick Hamilton Baker, were going to stage a polite but intensive campaign over which one would have the old tallow lamp in her sun parlor a half-century later, she would have shaken her fat sides with laughter. Everything was out of the wagon now, everything but one. Abby, standing in the grassy trail in front of the old sheep shed, was watching for it. On tiptoe, there in her ankle-length starched dress, her red-brown hair wound round her head and tucked into a snood, she was the picture of watchful waiting. She might have been carved in marble as expectancy. Let me," she called when her mother was bringing out the calfskin-covered box from under the wagon seat. "If you'll carry it careful." No need to caution Abby to be careful. In a warm feeling of pleasure over the temporary possession, she clasped her arms around its hairy sides, and the M.O.C. initials formed by nailheads. Inside the box lay all the accoutrements of another life. In its skin-covered depths was the equipment of an entirely different world. They were symbols of things in life to come. They represented the future in which she would someday live. She got down on her knees on the dirt floor with its earthy odor and pushed the little chest into the far dark corner under her mother's bed. Lovingly and lingeringly, she relinquished her hold upon it. For a few moments, she saw herself in that future, her red-brown hair in curls over her shoulders, a white silk shawl with roses in the corners, its folds held together with a lavender breastpin. There was a string of pearls around her neck, and she was waving a jeweled fan with long white fingers that tapered at the ends. There was soft music playing. She came out on a high stage ready to sing. Lovely ladies and courtly gentlemen were clapping their hands. Some of them stood up. She smiled at them and waved her jeweled fan. Abby? Abby, where are you? Quite suddenly, the gorgeous trappings fell away. She was back in the everyday world, hearing loud voices calling her. Abby! The voices were raised high in fright. She scrambled out backward from under the bed. Abby! Abby! Dennis and Mary were running toward her, their faces white with fear. The Indians are coming. A man here on horseback says the Indians are coming down the river. Abby scrambled back under the bed and brought out the hairy chest in her arms. Not to any wild heathenish Indian was Abby Mackenzie intending to relinquish the only tangible tie that bound her to the lovely lady.